at the edge of the bridge, her tear-filled eyes gazing down at the dark, silent water below. The street was deserted, empty like the ache inside her heart. She took a shaky breath, her fingers loosening their grip on the railing, and was about to jump off just then a firm hand wrapped around her arm, pulling her back. Before she could react, she found herself falling backward, landing with a thud on the empty road tangled with a stranger. Her eyes met his, a pair of hollow, beautiful eyes, as dark and empty as her own. He looked at her with a blank gaze. "Are you out of your mind? Killing yourself isn't the solution to anything." His low voice was stern, bordering on furious. Vine's heart pounded, partly from the shock of his words and partly from the way he held her gaze. Swiftly she scrambled off him, her chest heaving as she took in the realization of what she had almost done. She sat on the footpath, feeling small, while he lay there, staring silently at the night sky. Minutes slipped by in silence, Vine hugging her knees, whispering to herself, chiding her impulsive decision, her voice barely a murmur. After a moment she glanced towards the stranger, noticing how he hadn't moved. Something softened in her and she stood up, brushing off her clothes, then walked to where he lay, motionless. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft, cautious. He didn't answer, just continued staring at the stars. "What is your name?" she asked hesitantly. He answered after a brief moment. "𝐇𝐨𝐬𝐬. Nice name. I'm Vine. 𝐊𝐴𝐺𝐻. She bit her lips, staring at him. "𝐇𝐨𝐬𝐬, it's cold out here. You shouldn't sleep here all night." She hesitated before placing a tentative hand on his shoulder, feeling the chill of his coat. "You can come to my place if you want. It's nearby and I live alone anyway. You don't have anywhere else to go, do you?" He finally looked up at her, his gaze unreadable and piercing. "You don't have to pay me." She held her breath, nervous under his. He nodded slowly, sitting up. She smiled slightly, standing as he rose beside her. The dim glow from the streetlights outside cast soft shadows as 𝐇𝐨𝐬𝐬 followed Vine into her small old apartment of one bedroom. It was modest and a bit worn out, but it had a warmth that made it feel lived in and safe. As she set her things down, she turned to him, her expression gentle. "Have you eaten anything?" she asked softly. 𝐇𝐨𝐬𝐬 nodded with a lowered head. "I'll freshen up and make a bed for you," she said, walking into the bathroom and giving him some space alone. The moment she was out of sight, 𝐇𝐨𝐬𝐬 pulled out his phone, his fingers moving swiftly as he sent a message to his secretary. "Do the background check of Park Vine. I want all the information about her on my desk tomorrow." He sent it right away and got the reply in seconds. "Okay, sir. Do you want me to pick you up?" 𝐇𝐨𝐬𝐬 stared at the message for a while and typed, "No, I'll stay here and bring an old phone by tomorrow. I can't use this phone here." He sent the message and slid the phone in his pocket. 𝐇𝐨𝐬𝐬 sat there, his mind tangling up in thoughts and questions. Not long after, Vine reappeared, a towel draped around her shoulders and her face freshly washed. The weariness softened. "I leave for work early in the morning, so I'll make some breakfast for you in the morning. Make sure you eat it," she said in a serious tone, breaking the silence. 𝐇𝐨𝐬𝐬 hummed in response, already lying on the thin mattress she prepared for him. His gaze drifted to the ceiling, but a moment later he felt her presence close by. Vine carefully pulled the quilt over him, tucking it around his shoulder. "Don't catch a cold." His breath stilled as she leaned down, her face close to his, and ruffled his hair. "Good night, 𝐇𝐨𝐬𝐬." Her voice was soft, soothing, and something in her tone made his chest feel strangely light. Her closeness sparked an odd comfort he hadn't felt in years. He blinked, reaching a hand to his hair where her fingers had just been. As she turned to leave, he found himself calling out her name, his voice low. "Vine," she paused, her heart skipping as she turned back, the sound of his husky voice stirring something within her. "I can't sleep with lights on." Vine's face fell slightly, her eyes flickering with unease. "I'm afraid of the dark," she responded quietly, her fingers fidgeting at the edge of her sleeve. "I'm here, you don't scared anymore, he said spontaneously. The words hung in the air between them. Taeyong cursing himself inwardly for letting them slip out, but something in the way her eyes often made him hold his gaze. Wai nodded quietly for the first time in her life. She turned off the lights without feeling the familiar fear crawling up her spine. She settled on her own bed across the small room. Taeyong lay back. He felt her calmness seeping into him, the sound of her breathing lulling him into an unfamiliar peace. Few days later, the days had blended into a quiet routine, a pattern of early mornings and long nights. Wan's life hadn't changed much, but Taeyong's presence in her home added a warmth. Initially, he kept his distance, barely speaking, but with time he had begun to open up. When Wan pushed the creaking front door open, she found him sitting in the small living room, his head lowered and lost in thought. She felt a flutter in her chest and walked over. Her hollow eyes smiled as she reached out and ruffled his hair. Taeyong's eyes lifted to hers. "You're back," he said, his voice softer than usual. "I cooked tonight." Surprise lit up Wan's face, her eyes wide as she leaned back slightly. "You cooked? I didn't know you could do that," she murmured softly. "I'll be back in 5 minutes." Taeyong nodded as he watched her head to the bathroom. When she emerged a while later, her hair damp and face glowing, she was holding something folded in her hands. She walked over to where Taeyong sat and held out a jacket. It had changed the color, but warm. "I got this for you from a second-hand shop. It's getting cold and I thought you should stay warm. I'll buy you a new one once I get my income this month." Taeyong's eyes fell to the jacket before lifting to hers, his gaze blank. Wan's heart fell to her feet as she bit her lips, her eyes darting to the floor. "If you don't like it, I can change it." Taeyong shook his head and held it. "I like it, thank you." The sincerity in his words calmed her heart. "Come, let's eat. It's getting cold." She nodded and sat across the coffee table. Wan took a bite and her eyes lit up. "Taeyong, this is really good. I had no idea you could cook so well." He nodded, his eyes filled with awe. "Taeyong, I think you should find a different job. Being a cleaner can't be easy." She reached out and placed her hand on his. The warmth of her hand covering his made his breath hitch. "And you being a girl and working as a delivery driver, that's not easy either. You should change your job." Wan pressed her lips together and smiled bitterly. "I haven't told you about this phase of my life." She looked at him. "I have a criminal record and no company is willing to hire me. My degrees are of no use." She lowered her gaze to her lap, then stared at her intently. "My father filed a case against me for killing his beloved daughter's child and attempting to kill both his beloved wife and daughter." He frowned, his jaw tightened. "Why?" "Because his wife couldn't see me in that house and her daughter's fiancé is my ex, so she thinks I might seduce David and get back with him. David helped me out of jail, that's why my stepmother and her daughter kept bothering me and sent cops to my workplace. I was overwhelmed and that night I didn't know what got into me. I attempted suicide." She fixed her gaze on him. "But you saved me, and since you have come here, cops don't bother me anymore. Maybe David must have done something. However, you're lucky for me." Then held her hand and pulled her slightly towards him, taking her off guard. "Do you still love that David? Isn't he a cheater?" He asked in a low, husky voice, his dark gaze sent chills down her spine. "No, he didn't cheat. His mother and my stepmother are friends. His mother forced him to marry Grace." Taeyong nodded, releasing her and leaning back, his gaze now calm. "I'll do the dishes in the morning. Let's get some rest." Wan stood and prepared his makeshift bed in the corner of the room while Taeyong placed the dishes in the sink. As he lay down, Wan's hand found its familiar place, ruffling his dark hair as she whispered, "Good night, Taeyong." "Good night." He caught her wrist slightly, making her heart stutter as he pulled her towards him. "What are you doing to me? Why do I feel this way?" He muttered in barely audible voice. Wan looked at him confusingly. He shook his head and gently let go of her wrist. Wan walked to her bed and laid. After a moment of silence, she spoke. "Taeyong," he hummed in response, "you didn't tell me about your family." My family. I don't have anyone. My father died when I was young and my mother committed suicide. I'm sorry. It's okay, he said in a low tone. That night when I saw you on the bridge, I felt as if the history was repeating itself. A car hit my dad on that same road in front of my eyes, and then on that same road I saw my mom jumping off the bridge. His voice was weak as he held his chest when swiftly said, "𝐁𝐫𝐢𝐧𝐠, are you okay?" She moved to his side and asked worriedly. He was breathing heavily, clutching his chest. One covered his face. "𝐁𝐫𝐢𝐧𝐠, look at me." He fixed his gaze on her as she leaned towards him. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to bring the bad memories back to you." She mumbled with teary eyes. His breath came back to normal. "Wine, you wouldn't leave me, right?" He whispered, holding her hand. She shook her head. "I promise I won't leave you," she mumbled for the first time. She felt as if he smiled. "Thank you," he muttered, wiping her tears and resting her hand on his chest. "Would you mind if I lie on your lap just for tonight?" He asked hesitantly. Wine bit her lips. "I wouldn't." He placed his head on her lap and closed his eyes, still holding her hand. They both remained silent. Wine stared at his face. "𝐁𝐫𝐢𝐧𝐠, you know you're feeling so innocent. In simple words, you're beautiful." 𝐁𝐫𝐢𝐧𝐠 opened his eyes and stared at her. "I hope you don't change this statement in the future," he said gloomily and closed his eyes. Wine shook her head, not understanding what he meant, while 𝐁𝐫𝐢𝐧𝐠 was lost in thoughts, thinking if he should tell her his identity. Time skipped. The weeks turned into months, and Wine had grown accustomed to the comforting presence that 𝐁𝐫𝐢𝐧𝐠 brought into her life. The once hollow space in her heart began to fill with hope, and she found herself smiling more. 𝐁𝐫𝐢𝐧𝐠, on the other hand, discovered warmth in Wine's simple gestures and carefree laughter, something he hadn't felt in years. There was an ease between them now, a quiet understanding that words often couldn't capture. Today 𝐁𝐫𝐢𝐧𝐠 had surprised Wine by suggesting they eat out. It wasn't typical for him, but when he saw the way her eyes lit up, he knew it was worth it. As they stepped into the bustling streets, Wine glanced at him, her brows knitted with slight concern. "𝐁𝐫𝐢𝐧𝐠, you shouldn't waste your money like this. Please cancel the reservation, you'll get your payment back." She tugged at his sleeve. He shook his head in denial. "I'm not wasting it." Wine puffed her cheeks and stopped in her tracks. 𝐁𝐫𝐢𝐧𝐠 turned toward her with a raised brow. "I'm not going. Let's go somewhere less expensive. Please." "I know a place that's perfect. Please, 𝐁𝐫𝐢𝐧𝐠." He let out a sigh, running his fingers through his hair and moving close to her. "It's been 15 minutes since we are out and you are yapping about the same thing." She nodded vigorously. "Yes, and you should agree to what I'm saying." Then stared at her cheeks, which were red due to the cold air. "Okay, just this time. Next time, I won't listen to you." She smiled and nodded, and patted her cheek. "You always smell so good," she muttered, leaning closer and inhaling his cologne. 𝐁𝐫𝐢𝐧𝐠 gulped at the closeness. "I had seen a copy of the same perfume in the stall. Yours seems branded. How did you get it?" Wine looked at him, then cleared his throat, looking away. I got it in the garbage." He shrugged his shoulders. Wine nodded as they began walking. "Don't worry, 𝐁𝐫𝐢𝐧𝐠. I'll save more money and gift you this perfume." He barely nodded. Wine led him to a small cozy restaurant tucked away in the quiet alley. They ordered their food, and as they waited, Wine scrolled through her phone, her eyes catching a post that made her chuckle. "Look at this," she said, turning her phone to 𝐁𝐫𝐢𝐧𝐠. It was a picture showing the CEO of the Hidden Realm, taken from behind. His salute striking. "Doesn't he have the same back as you?" 𝐁𝐫𝐢𝐧𝐠 choked the air as a shadow passed through his face. He quickly gulped down the water. "What happened?" He shook his head and composed himself. "Nothing," he muttered and pointed at the photo with his chin. "You think so?" he asked. Wine's eyes sparkled as she nodded. "I do, and you know what? I have always wanted to see you in a tuxedo. You'd look like a model, I swear. You're already so handsome." "You think I'm handsome?" He leaned forward slightly, eyes fixed on hers, his expression suddenly serious, the faintest hint of a smile playing on his lips. Wine's cheeks turned pink and she glanced down at her hands flustered. "I mean, well, yes." She stammered, unable to look at him directly. Thames' gaze softened, and for the first time he allowed himself to enjoy the lightness of the moment. The quiet confidence, the way he watched her with a teasing glint was a side of him Wayne hadn't seen before. It made her heart race. Before either of them could say more, the waiter arrived with their food, breaking the spell. The plates clattered on the table, and they both straightened. As they began eating, Wayne glanced at him from the corner of her eye. He hadn't touched his food. Instead, he was staring at her intently. "Why are you not eating? Don't you like it?" she asked with a stuffed mouth. He leaned forward without breaking his gaze away from her. "I like watching you eat." Wayne blinked several times. "I couldn't eat if you kept staring at me like this." She could feel her cheeks heating up. "Eat it. Once this gets cold, it wouldn't be this delicious." She muttered nervously. Tim nodded and lowered his head, not wanting to disturb her further. They ate in silence and stepped out of the cozy warmth of the restaurant and into the cool night air. Their footsteps echoed in the stillness as they made their way home. Wayne held Tim's hand the moment her fingers brushed his. She stopped, noticing the chill that seeped from his skin. "Your hand is so cold. Let me warm it for you," she whispered, wrapping both of her smaller hands around his, holding it delicately and rubbing his hand between hers with gentle strokes. Tim's breath hitched slightly, his heart skipping a beat as he watched her. Never did someone's touch make him feel like this. "You're quite sensitive to cold," she smiled, looking up at him. "Once my stepmother locked me out of the house in snow. I still feel the chills thinking about it." She shivered at the thought. Tim clenched his jaw. The muscle in his jaw ticked. Without thinking, he pulled her into his arms. Wayne gasped as her face was pressed against his chest. She could hear his heartbeat. After a moment of silence, she spoke to distract him. "Tim, this jacket looks good on you. I'll buy you more." Tim's grip on her tightened. He placed his chin on her head. "What about you? Don't you like anything?" "You always think about me. There are women out there who want branded clothes, shoes, accessories, wealth, and whatnot. They do so much to get it." Wayne pulled out with a smile, placing her hands on his chest. "I know. I want good health and a peaceful life first. Then yes, I want wealth and money, but not by selling myself for my dignity. I'll get it at the right time." He stared into her eyes and sucked the hair behind her ear. Warmth flooded through him as he stared at her. "Wayne," he whispered. "What's it?" she whispered back, mesmerized by his deep eyes. "You don't know what you do to me. I feel like I am losing all my senses." He whispered, stroking her cheek with his knuckles. Wayne was too lost in his eyes and touch to take the notice of his words. The car horn made her flinch and snapped her back to the reality. Flustered, he looked away. "Why would you forgive me if I kept a crucial phase of my life a secret from you?" She frowned and passed him a questioning gaze. "I'll tell you at the right time, no matter what. You wouldn't leave me." "What do you mean?" "Nothing. You'll know at the right time." He patted her cheek. Wayne nodded, her mind raced with tons of questions, but she shrugged them off. "I'll tell you everything once I settle everything with Grandma and make it clear to her," he thought, letting out a sigh. Few days later, Wayne and Tim had been a bit distant from each other due to their awakening feelings and desires. Today, Wayne went to meet her best friend Kyra as she returned from abroad after a year. They sat in the cozy cafe. Wayne felt an inexplicable heaviness in her chest as she recounted the past few months with him. Kyra's eyes widened as she listened, concern ached across her face. "Wait, you're telling me you have been living with him for 4 months? Wayne, how could you trust him so easily? You barely knew him when he moved in. What if he had ulterior motives? What if he wanted to harm you or take advantage of your kindness? You can't forget that he is a man, and men," she said in one breath. Wayne interrupted her. "Wait, Kyra, breathe. I know it sounds crazy, but Theo isn't like that. He's different." Wayne leaned back, the tension in her shoulders easing just slightly as she remembered the way his eyes softened whenever he looked at her. Kyra's eyes narrowed in disbelief. Different? How? You said he's quite distant sometimes. What if that's just an act? When people can hide who they really are, what if you're wrong about it? Wine bit her lip, looking down at her hands as she played with the edge of her sweater. I don't know why I trusted him. When I brought him home, it felt right. I can't explain it. But there's this pull. He makes me feel safe, Kyra. I know it's irrational, but I believe him. Kyra sighed, leaning back in her chair. You sound like you have already made up your mind, but I still think you should be careful. You never really know someone, not completely. Sometimes it takes years to see a person's true colors. And sometimes you can spend your whole life with them and still be surprised. I noticed slowly her heart thudding in her chest. I know I'll be careful. Wine said, showing her Thames picture. This is him. He's handsome, isn't he? Kyra smiled, noticing the enthusiasm in her voice. You haven't fallen for him, have you? She leaned forward and teased. A flush rose to Wine's cheek and she looked away, the heat spreading down her neck. Of course not, she said too quickly, the words sounding unconvincing even to her own ears. Kyra's grin widened and Wine sighed, glancing back at her friend. I didn't mean to feel this way, it just happened. Kyra's playful expression faded into one of understanding. She reached across the table and squeezed Wine's hand. Just promise me whatever happens, you'll stay cautious. Sometimes it takes one moment to shatter everything you thought you knew. Wine's eyes met Kyra's and she nodded. Her heart was already on a path she couldn't stop and she wasn't sure she wanted to. They both sat and talked, catching up on the time they missed together. The evening sun dipped when Wine pushed the door open. She winced as a sharp pain shot through her leg, causing her to limp slightly. The sound caught Thames' attention and he looked up from his usual spot on the worn-out couch, eyes narrowing with concern as he took in her expression. In a heartbeat, he was by her side, his hand steadying her as he helped her to a seat. The warmth of his hands sent a calming wave through her. What happened? He asked, voice tight with worry, while let out a soft sigh, a tired smile tugging at her lips. It's nothing serious, just a motorbike that bumped into me on the way back. I'm okay. Theo's jaw clenched, eyes darkened with anger. Without another word, he knelt in front of her, examining her leg with a frown. The room was silent, save for the gentle rustle of fabric and the soft rhythmic sound of their breathing. He carefully wrapped her ankle, his touch so tender that it made her heart throb in her chest. Once finished, Them glanced up, their eyes met. Thank you. He passed her a small smile, stroking her cheek. How was your meeting with your friend? He took her hand and placed her palm on his cheek. It was good. She forced a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes as Kyra's words kept replaying in her mind. Them nodded, shifting slightly. Wine, tomorrow I'll be going to my village for a few days. There are matters I need to take care of. He intertwined his fingers with hers. For how long will you be away? She asked in a low tone. He pressed his thumb against the back of her hand. Maybe a week, but when I come back, I want to talk to you. About us, about me, about what we are. I don't want this to stay nameless anymore. There's more I want to tell you. Just wait for me, okay? He said, lifting her hand and brushing his lips against her knuckles. A gesture so tender, it made her eyes sting with unshed tears. Why not lowering her head? Take care of yourself while I'm gone. He lifted her chin and brushed his thumb over her lips. Wine's breath caught in her throat. I will. No matter where I go, Wine, all my paths lead me back to you. You must trust me, okay? She smiled and nodded, holding his hand, then let out a sigh and pressed his forehead against hers.